President Trump has been back in office now for a little over a month, and at times it's been hard to keep up with the flurry of executive orders and major cuts to federal agencies.
Joining us now live from Washington, D.C. is Connect to Congress is Washington Representative Marilyn Strickland. She's a Democrat who represents the state's 10th Congressional District, which includes Olympia, other portions of Thurston and Pierce County. Congresswoman, it's nice to have you with us this morning.
Nice to see you again.
First off, what are your constituents telling you about these federal cuts, particularly job cuts that we're seeing in so many departments right now?
What I'm hearing from my constituents is that they are scared. This fear is turning into anger, and they just really don't understand what's happening, especially when President Trump ran on the promise of lowering costs, dealing with the cost of living and all the things that people are really concerned about. I will also say this too, because of my district and its makeup, a lot of military veterans are employed at some of these federal agencies. So in addition to disrespecting the people who have served our country and are now employed by, say, the Veterans Administration and other federal agencies, it just doesn't make sense to a lot of people.
Just as you mentioned right there, these military areas, part of Pierce and Thurston counties, bracing for potentially more cuts impacting military spending. What would you like to be seen done here? And what are you hearing from people in terms of how they're bracing for it?
I mean, I think that people are looking at their savings accounts. They're looking at the fact that, they have to pay mortgages, they have to pay rent. A lot of them have different types of, bills and financial obligations. I will also say, too, though, as you think about this whole idea of improving government efficiency, I don't think there's anyone who's against that. But you can't arbitrarily go into agencies that you know nothing about, slash jobs, and then end up saying, oh, wait a minute, I didn't mean to do that. And so, government efficiency is something that everyone should strive for. And I think the people who work in the federal government do that. The number of federal employees, by the way, has been pretty steady since the 60s. So it's not as though there are all these people working in government who don't belong there. But the question for me becomes, if we're going to be efficient, then do it in a thoughtful way. What is your goal, for example? Do you want to decrease wait times that veterans have to endure when they're trying to get an appointment? How do you work backwards from that? But this arbitrary cutting of government employees, demonizing public servants who keep us safe, who make sure our water is clean, who keep us safe when we do air travel, who serve veterans, all these very important public functions, those are jobs that should be respected. And to arbitrarily cut people hurts our livelihoods, it's bad for the economy, and it's just bad public policy.
So, Congresswoman, what is that thoughtful way of making some of these cuts when the country has such a huge deficit then?
Yeah, so here's the deal. So one thing I often say is being more efficient does not mean cutting people. So I think the question is, what's your desired outcome? The example I use again, do we want to reduce wait times with the Veterans Administration? Do we want to cut through red tape so that things can be done more quickly and more efficiently? Set the goal first, then ask yourself, the people, the supervisors who are actually have oversight of the employees, what can we do better? There's a way to be more efficient, but just firing a bunch of people without any thought or consideration is not one of them. And the Associated Press just reported a few minutes ago that 20 people who work for the federal government who are saying to, Elon Musk and Donald Trump, they don't want to be part of this because the people they have brought in do not understand government, they don't know what they're doing, and they're incompetent.
You talk about finding a place where government can be most efficient. Are there any areas where Democrats can also find common ground on those federal spending cuts?
Oh, I mean, I think there are places to find common ground, but you can't do things that hurt people. So there's a budget that's going to be presented probably sometime today or tomorrow. And in order to balance the budget that they want to do so that they can provide tax breaks to billionaires, they're going to cut food stamps and Medicaid and health care for children. So again, we want to talk to people who are being rational and thoughtful, but to arbitrarily come in and say we're going to cut a bunch of services and hurt people does nothing to lower costs. It doesn't help the economy, and it does not help the American people. So if there's a common sense conversation to be had, we're always for it. But to come in there and just do these things arbitrarily and hurt people in both red states and blue states, things that hurt Democrats and Republicans, it's just irresponsible.
I want to ask you about immigration. You've been a supporter of comprehensive immigration reform coming from Congress.
Yes.
What are your thoughts on the administration's current push to deport migrants with criminal records and to cut off federal funding from so-called sanctuary cities and states?
So, I think about the number of people who've been deported so far, and these numbers are actually smaller than the deportations that President Biden has done. And so I think some of it is a lot of bluster to make people scared. But again, we have had a bill last year that was worked on in a bipartisan manner in the US Senate that dealt with the border, that had a very thoughtful way to staff up and to think about comprehensive immigration reform in a very important, thoughtful, compassionate way that did deal with people who shouldn't be here, but also understanding that immigrants are a big part of the US economy. If you just decided to deport a bunch of people, our economy would crater. There's a reason that dairy farmers and farmers across the country were sounding the alarm when Trump talked about deportation. Immigrants are in every part of our economy, whether it's technology, whether it's healthcare, whether it's agriculture, everywhere. So let's do this in a thoughtful way. Let's provide opportunities for people who are here to get access to citizenship. But again, to engage in terror and to scare people and to say we're going to deport tens of millions of people arbitrarily doesn't make any sense, and it's bad for the economy.
Yeah, not just deportation, but detainment itself. We're hearing of a Trump plan to possibly use military sites to detain people. What's your reaction to that?
You know, the weaponization of the military is one of the things that I was most fearful of when I thought about the Trump administration. And let me give you an example of what's happening right now. If you look at the people who have been appointed to be Secretary of Defense, the firing of General C.Q. Brown, this does not say that we care about having a strong defense that is there to defend the homeland and to support our allies abroad. What it says is, I want people who are loyal to me and my agenda. It sounds far-fetched, but the weaponization of our military to use it on our own citizens is something that could actually happen under this administration if people aren't doing exactly what he wants them to do. In addition to that, yesterday at the United Nations, we voted and denied that Russia invaded Ukraine. That is completely absurd. So if you want to get some ideas of what direction this administration wants to go, it's more pro-Russia than pro-USA. And the idea that Ukraine invaded Russia and Russia didn't invade Ukraine is absolutely ridiculous. So let's keep the military intact. Let's hire the best and brightest. Let's not compromise recruitment and retention. Let's give everyone who wants to serve the military and is qualified a chance to do so. Let's strengthen the homeland, and let's take care of our allies abroad and be good partners. But what I see happening right now is the opposite, and we're going in the wrong direction.
Obviously, Democrats like yourself are in the minority in both chambers of Congress right now. So what do you think you can get done this session? What are some of your priorities?
I mean, my priorities don't change regardless of who's in office. And I always say this, you know, my office, my district office in Olympia and Lakewood, we're still there to help people navigate the Veterans Administration, Social Security, the IRS, the Small Business Administration, always helping people get the benefits that they're owed and to help them navigate these tough things. We have a housing crisis in Washington State and in the 10th Congressional District and up and down the I-5 corridor. We must build more housing. We must work with the private sector and do what we can to make sure that we have the talent, the labor, and the materials needed to build housing. And as I think about some of these tariffs that President Trump wants to impose on Canada, that does not help with those causes. So housing is always going to be a priority, taking care of our military families, getting them a basic allowance for housing, making sure that we are doing everything we can to keep people safe, and being very thoughtful about addressing the things that matter most to people, lowering the cost of living.
All right, Congresswoman Marilyn Strickland from our state's 10th Congressional District. Thank you so much for joining us for ARC and for Connect to Congress.
Great. Thanks for having me. Nice to see you.
You as well.
It's a difficult job. I mean, obviously, we're in very contentious times right now. You know, as we mentioned, Democrats are in the minority, and Republicans have control of both chambers of Congress and obviously the White House, and are really pushing through their agenda at the moment. So, you know, that doesn't change the fact that folks in Congress who happen to be Democrats like her are still trying to focus on some of their main priorities to make life better for people in their districts.
Yep, and lots of reaction coming in. It feels like every single day there's something different when it comes to these cuts at the federal government, whether it's people who are cut and then hired back, or just even when you think about these emails that were sent out by Elon Musk to say respond or else. You know, this is something where clearly it changes day to day, so it's
does.
hard to have a single consensus on it, but we'll be watching it throughout the week, and clearly it's just, you know, we're about a month into a new administration.
And she had
a few
mentioned
years to go.
She had mentioned the update that came in too about 20 people who work in the Department of Government Efficiency stepping down from their positions because they didn't agree with some of the actions that were being taken from the administration at this point. That news just coming down this morning. So many changes, and as you say, it seems like it happens every single day with all these changes coming in. Yeah.
It does.